Morning. So we're going to pick up in Isaiah 11. We're going to read verses 10 and 12. And then I want to talk about a passage that we read last week, Isaiah 66, 18 to 20, before we start moving into the rest of the next section on the outline. So Isaiah 11, 10 and 12. In that day, the root of Jesse shall stand. Who shall stand as a signal for the peoples? Of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. He will raise a signal for the nations and will assemble the banished of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. So we've been talking about the gathering of the dispersed of Judah and the raising of the signal. And I wanted to return to Isaiah 66, 18 to 20, which we looked at, I think, verse 20 last week. And it occurred to me that I should have read a couple of verses before that because there's some significant teaching there. So I've made the point in past weeks that this regathering of the people and bringing them back into the land and them enjoying the covenant blessings is connected to the gospel going out to the nations and people being gathered into Christ's kingdom through the gospel. And this verse actually highlights that as well. So I wanted to go through this. So verse 18, again, this is in the new heavens and new earth section of Isaiah, talking about the new heavens and new earth. And says, "For I know their works and their thoughts, and the time is coming to gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and shall see my glory, and I will set a sign among them. And from them I will send survivors to the nations, to Tarshish, Pool, and Lud, who draw the bow, to Tubal and Javan, to the coastlands far away, that have not heard my fame or seen my glory. And they shall declare my glory among the nations, and they shall bring all your brothers from all the nations as an offering to the Lord, on horses and in chariots and in litters and on mules and on dromedaries, to my holy mountain Jerusalem, says the Lord, just as the Israelites bring their grain offering in a clean vessel to the house of the Lord." So you'll remember we talked about this. Mike had a comment about the bringing the offering in a clean vessel. We talked about that also for a little bit. I guess since we're in the end of the verse here, I'll just mention that the offering is in the analogy here, the offering is the Israelites who are coming back to the Lord. So the Israelites of faith, and they're being brought in a clean vessel, which is the people from the nations are bringing the Israelites with them back into the kingdom of God. And so that's what the last verse there, I think, is referencing. But verses 18 and 19 talk about the Lord setting his sign or his signal among them. This also comes from what we read in Isaiah 11, and that he will gather the people that way, and he'll send survivors, verse 19, to the nations, to Tarshish, Pool, to Lud, to Tubal, to Javan, to the coastlands far away, to people who have not heard of him or seen his glory before, and they shall declare his glory among the nations, and then they shall bring all your brothers from the nations as an offering to the Lord. So what this says is that foreigners will receive the word about the Lord, and they'll gather around him, and they will be instructed in the Lord and then sent out to their own nations, where they will share the good news about the Lord, and people in those foreign nations will hear of the Lord and come to him, including the scattered chosen of Israel. And this is exactly what happens in Acts 2. People from all over the Roman world, from all the nations, are gathered there, and they hear the word of the Lord, and many of them are converted, and they go back to their nations, and they start spreading the gospel. And I'm not saying this is a prediction of Acts 2, I'm just saying the pattern is the same. And what we have here is a description, basically, of how the Israelites finally are gathered, and they're gathered because the gospel goes to the nations, and it's through the nations then that the Israelites are brought back to the Lord. This is what Paul talks about in Romans 9 through 11 about Israel is experiencing a partial hardening right now, but that in the end, all Israel will be saved. And it will be because, as I think Mike brought this up last week too, it will be because the Israelites are provoked to jealousy. At least that's the word picture being used in Romans 11, where they see God's blessing on Gentiles. And they basically say that this is my interpretation. It's not in Romans 9 through 11, but they basically say those are supposed to be our blessings that are on them. And we see clearly that they're receiving the blessings of God. And so we want to have the blessings of God, which are ours. And they come to Christ through that. And that presupposes a time when the church is it's much more clear that you can look at God's people and see Christ in the church than it is maybe today. So we're looking forward to that also. So anyway, so I wanted to look at that Isaiah 66 passage again, kind of start there about the gathering of the people having something to do with the gospel so we can have the right paradigm when we're thinking about these passages. Do any of you have any comments about that or questions from
Well,
anything
I
I
have a
said?
couple of questions.
Okay,
Oh, I'm
sure,
sorry, I
Shirley.
didn't mean to.
No, you know
Okay.
me. I just keep talking. So it's easy to interrupt me because I just keep talking.
Well, I apologize anyway. Um,
All right.
I have a question on 19 as well as one on 20. And
Yeah.
my question on 19 is, I think it's a simple question. Uh, is it talking about when it speaks of they will be the one to declare my glory among the Gentiles? Is it speaking saying there'll be missionaries that will be carrying the message of Christ to the world?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, simple.
Missionaries.
And
And
then,
it's missionaries from the Gentile nations.
oh, okay, that's what I was thinking. But I was making sure I was on the right frame of thought. And then on verse 20, I'm just wondering if this could be a time of the return of the Jews being dispersed around the world.
Yeah, it is talking about the great ingathering, and Paul equates that with all Israel being saved through the Gentiles. The Gentiles' knowledge of Christ is affects the Jews in such a way eventually that there is a great return like that. But as you know, as the other several other scriptures say, the regathering of God's people, which is often prophesied in the Old Testament, also involves, you know, Gentiles as God's people. In Amos, it talks about David's fallen tent will be restored, and that's used in Acts 2 or 3 by James. No, it's not, sorry, it's Acts 15 by James to talk about the Gentiles coming into the church. And he says that's a fulfillment of that regathering prophecy, even though it sounds like the text is just talking about David and his kingdom. It says the
Mm-hmm.
reconstituting of David's tent is the gathering into the church of Gentiles. So, but I do think this
Okay.
Isaiah 66 passage has parallels with Romans 9 through 11, which is about the ultimate um, regathering of God's people from among the Jewish uh, people. So,
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much.
yeah.
I guess just a broad comment. You talked about sort of the patterns and pictures, and I guess something I see emerging from these patterns is, look at the days before where God's people, he delivered them into their land, and then said, keep don't be influenced by the countries around you. And of course they did, and they dispersed, and they intermingled with the countries around them and adopted their religious practices. And then in the later days, you have them being dispersed in exile, and the calling back of them is almost through them adopting the practices of the people around them, because those people have been given the word of God and the Spirit. And so it's one of those, like, what they meant for evil in past days of abandoning God, God repurposed for good, and that they would that would be their way of being called back to God, is by
Hmm.
adopting the faith of the nations around them, or that they were
Wow.
occupying.
Yeah, it's really good. Really good observation. Thanks for mentioning that. I am sure that's 100% accurate. Really good. Okay. So, so I want to move on and talk about a phrase from Isaiah 11:12. It's the very end of that uh, he will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth, the four corners of the earth. So I want to talk about that because that's mentioned in several passages in both the Old and the New Testament, and it'll help us with that. So first passage is Deuteronomy 28:64. This is at the end of the recitation of the covenant curses, and this is one of the final curses here. As they've been kind of escalating and building on each other as the hardness of the heart of the Jewish people gets harder and harder, and the resistance to God becomes more firm. And the Lord escalates judgments, and this is one of the last ones. And it says, "And the Lord will scatter you among all the peoples, among all the peoples, from one end of the earth to the other. And there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known." After this, the Lord says even if they never repent, he's still going to be faithful to his covenant. So this isn't a prophecy of complete and utter abandonment, but it does use the idea of being scattered, all over the earth, one end of the earth to the other. And this idea is summarized by the idiom, to the four corners of the earth, which we'll see coming up. So here the Lord says he's going to scatter the nations, or scatter them among the nations, which you just mentioned, Mike. He's going to scatter them among the nations because of their unbelief and their hard heart, and from one end of the earth to the other. Zechariah 2:6, maybe we want to look at a little bit more. Let's see. Yeah, let's look at 2, starting verse 1, Zechariah 2. "And I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. And then I said, Where are you going? And he said to me, To measure Jerusalem, to see what it is its width and what is its length. And behold, the angel who talked with me came forward, and another angel came forward to meet him, and said to him, Run, say to that young man, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as villages without walls, because of the multitude of people and livestock in it. And I will be to her a wall of fire all around, declares the Lord, and I will be the glory in her midst." So this is a prophecy of blessing, right? This is using Exodus language, the pillar, the fire all around them. It's the Lord, and it's talking about a time when Jerusalem doesn't need to have its own protection. It's not a walled city anymore. It's a bunch of open city, lots of villages, lots of people there because it's so big, so it's prosperous. So this is a regathering, reconstitution prophecy. And if you remember in Zechariah's time, this is about 520 BC. The people had been released from exile 16 years before that, come back to rebuild the temple. Most of them stayed in Babylon, but some of them had come back, and they were having a kind of a hard time of it. They weren't really seeing God's promises being fulfilled. And there, as I said, a lot of them still in Babylon. Verse 6, up, the Lord's speaking, flee from the land of the north, flee from Babylon, get out of Babylon, declares the Lord. For I have spread you abroad as the four winds of the heavens, declares the Lord. Up, escape to Zion, you who dwell with the daughter of Babylon. For thus said the Lord of hosts, after his glory sent me to the nations who plundered you. For he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. Behold, I will shake my hand over them, and they shall become plunder for those who serve them. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me. Sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for behold, I come, and I will dwell in your midst, declares the Lord. And many nations shall join themselves to the Lord in that day, and shall be my people. And I will dwell in your midst, and you shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. And the Lord will inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land, and will again choose Jerusalem. Be silent, all flesh, before the Lord, for he has roused himself from his holy dwelling. This passage again has, come out of the nation, come out of the, Babylon, come out of the nation. He's talking to the Jews that are still in Babylon in 520, telling them to come back because he's going to begin fulfilling his promises to them. And then he expands his promises to include all of the nations, and not just Jews come out of the nations, but he's going to actually have the nations as his inheritance and his people. But anyway, we went to this passage because it has the idea of I've scattered you and spread you abroad to the four winds of the heavens, declares the Lord. That's in verse 6. So we have a scattering and regathering idea going on here. Back to Deuteronomy 30, verse 4. If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you. So let's back up, maybe read the first couple of verses in this chapter. Starting with verse 1. And when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you. So this is a word for them when they've been scattered. So Moses, the Lord through Moses, directs this to people who are living, in Babylon or in the exile. Says, when you recall them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today with all your heart and with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you, and he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it. And he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. And the Lord your God will put all these curses on your foes and enemies who persecuted you. And you shall again obey the voice of the Lord and keep all his commandments that I command you today. And then goes on with prosperity of covenant blessings. So the Lord talks about them being scattered because of their disobedience, and then he's going to bring them back even if they're in the uttermost parts of heaven, verse 4. And then Nehemiah 1, 8 and 9, which Nehemiah is thinking of this passage. When in Nehemiah, he's thinking of Deuteronomy 30, Nehemiah 1, 8 and 9. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. So it's the same. Obviously, it's the same as the Deuteronomy passage, and the Lord will gather his people, and that brings us to Matthew 24:31, and I think that this will be helpful. This kind of gathering thing. So Matthew 24 is the Olivet Discourse. There's not a consensus on how to understand this whole passage. Some people say it's all about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Some people say it's all about the future second coming of Christ, and some people say it's a mix. And those are basically the options that you have. But if we look at, let's say, verse 29, we'll just start there. That looks like where the paragraph, at least in the ESV, starts. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, those days being the days he's just described. The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So we've seen the language about being scattered to the four winds. We've seen, one end of heaven to the other. And this is a reference to those passages and that regathering. But as we've read about that regathering in the passages where it's mentioned, that regathering is a gathering of all God's people, Jew and Gentile. It is a gathering done by the gospel. And so that should inform us, actually, when we read the Olivet Discourse, which is highly figurative and a lot of apocalyptic images, that when Jesus uses language and images from the Old Testament, we want to be able to be informed about what he's talking about by understanding the Old Testament, and then use that to help us understand what he's talking about here. And so I would submit that instead of what might look like the surface interpretation, that there's going to be an angelic host sent out to regather his people, from all over the world, that this is actually the word for angel here is the word for messenger, that this is his messengers, his gospel preachers going out to gather his elect from one end of the earth to the other. And they do that because they're sent out by Christ with the gospel to do that. So I know with all the other imagery that's going on in the passage there, all the quotations from, there's language in verse 29 from like Isaiah 19, there's language in verse 30 from Daniel 7. You have to have some understanding of those passages too, to be able to get a clear picture of what's going on here. Sounded like you were going to say something, Mike.
Yeah, I was just going to say for verse 31 there, if you take that to mean that he will send out his angels, that he's sending out his disciples to preach the gospel, right?
Right.
Is that then is the previous verse, you see the Son of Man coming in the clouds? Is that like the Pentecost, the coming of the Spirit of Christ to anoint his angels or disciples to go out and preach the word?
Yeah, Pentecost is Pentecost is related to it. There's a complex of events that have to do with the coming of Christ on the clouds, but Pentecost is intimately related to it. The coming of Christ on or with clouds or on clouds. Is it with or on? It's on.
Yeah.
The Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. The language is important because it's the reference to Daniel 7:13, where the Son of Man comes on clouds of heaven, or actually the one like a Son of Man. I saw one like a Son of Man coming on clouds of heaven.
Yeah.
And he came to the Ancient of Days, right? And so he's going up, not down. And he goes up and he receives from the Ancient of Days all power and authority in a kingdom that will never end. And so the coming on clouds, the Son of Man coming on clouds language refers to the ascension and the reception by Christ of his reward from the Father. So he receives a kingdom and a people. And then because he is the ascended Christ sitting on the throne, he then pours out the Spirit. So it's the first act of the ascended Christ is to empower his people, to identify his people with the pouring out of the Spirit and empower them so they can send, so that gospel can go out. So it's clearly related to Pentecost there, as far as the sending of the messengers going out, but it isn't particularly limited to those messengers. When Christ sends you out to talk to your neighbor, you're doing this. So it's the going out of the gospel to the to actually, to the nations, right? We send missionaries to the nations, and God's elect are scattered among the nations, and they hear the gospel and they respond with faith. And then and some of those people are Jewish, and so they're being brought back, regathered, and that's what the Great Regathering is bringing them into Christ's kingdom, wherever the local manifestation of that kingdom is. So they don't have to all come back to Jerusalem to do that, but they did come at Pentecost, right? The nations came to learn the law of the Lord, like Isaiah 2 says. In the last days, right, the nations will come to Zion to hear the law of the Lord. And then they'll go back out and evangelize. And that's basically what happens at Pentecost. So I know that Matthew 24, I just jumped into the middle of this highly figurative discourse. I know that you might, anybody have any other questions? I'll just ask. Anybody have a question about anything here?
Well, on verse 30, you can let me know if I'm thinking right or was taught right or whatever. I was taught that Jesus went to heaven on a cloud. So the angels tell the disciples that he will come back the same way that he went. So, and
right.
that's a whole lot what this particular verse is saying. Is that correct?
Well, all the parts of it, except, at least in my understanding, in my understanding, this is not a verse about the second coming, and that's because the reference to Son of Man coming on clouds. We'll just look at it so you can see the language. Daniel 7. Go to Daniel 7 and look at verse 13. So the Matthew passage was, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. That was what Jesus said in Matthew. You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. This is Daniel 7:13. Daniel writes, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, was presented before him. This is the passage that Jesus is referring to. And this is not a second coming passage. Jesus is coming actually into the heavenly courtroom. You can see that in verse 9. It says, as I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. It's going to be described, right? His clothing was white as snow. Hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him, and thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court stood in judgment, and the books were opened. And then it's talking about the little horn next, but that's kind of a parenthetical thing, easily put aside by just looking at the context. So what's happening is Daniel is given a vision of the Ancient of Days on the throne in a courtroom, the heavenly courtroom, surrounded by angels who are ready to do his bidding. And then he sees coming, verse 13, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. As I mentioned before, the New American Standard, at least, and maybe some other translations that I'm not aware of, but the New American Standard actually says, there came up one, it puts the word up, came up, one like the Son of Man. So just, clarifying that Jesus is going, or the Son of Man, who is Jesus, he's going to the Ancient of Days, to this throne room. And where's the throne room? The throne room is the heavenly throne room. It's not on earth. He's not going down. He's coming up. And so he comes to the Ancient of Days, and he's presented before him. And then verse 14, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. When does that happen? Does that happen on earth or in heaven? No, that happens in heaven. When Jesus ascends to the Father, it is at that point when he arrives in the Father's presence in the heavenly courtroom, that he is then given a kingdom and dominion and all things, so that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him, as it says there. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So the picture, Shirley, is a picture of the Son of Man coming on clouds, is a picture of the Son of Man coming to the Father to receive the kingdom, to receive all authority after the Son's mediatorial work. So
Oh,
crucified, died,
okay.
resurrected, and then ascends and receives all power and authority um, from the Father. And so when Jesus says um, in Matthew 24 that you'll see the Son of Man, actually what Matthew 24 says isn't that exactly. Matthew 24:30 says, "Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man." And some other translations have it parsed in such a way that that what the intent of the meaning is, that you will see a sign that the Son of Man has been enthroned in heaven, that the Son of Man is in heaven. You'll see a sign. There will appear in the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They'll see the Son of Man coming. What is the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven? It is the outpouring of the Spirit. It is the bringing of judgment on first century Jerusalem. It is the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven, is his outworking of his authority. Just one more example, real quick. If you go to Matthew 26, verse 64, Jesus is standing before the high priest, and Jesus said to him, you have said so, but I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. That is not a second coming passage. From now on, first century, you condemned me. You're condemning me in this trial. But from now on, you'll see the Son of Man, me. I'll be vindicated. I'll be seated at the right hand of the Father. And I'm coming in the clouds of heaven. And the coming is this, again, it's the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven is always going to be a reference to the Daniel passage. So he's not coming on the clouds of heaven is a phrase that denotes the Son of Man receiving all this power and authority and being in the position. In this case, he's saying, "You're judging me now, but I will judge you. I'll be seated next to the power, at the right hand of the power in heaven. And you yourself from now on will see that I'm actually seated there, because you will see not Jesus, but what Jesus does. The resilience of his church, the pouring out of the Spirit, again, the judgment on Jerusalem, I think, is ultimately what's in view here. So the phrase is important. It's also the same phrase in chapter 1 of Revelation, right? Behold, he comes with clouds, or behold, I come with clouds. Every eye will see me, etc. It's not a second coming passage. It's the passage about I'm coming with the authority that I have with the Father. And you don't actually have to, even though he says every eye will see me, you don't actually have to physically see him. The see me language is we use that, right? Oh, I see how 2 + 2 could be 4, right? We talk about intellectual comprehension as seeing. It's not always have to be physical.
Right.
Yeah. So I think I probably should substantiate that just so we. Yeah. So let's look at Isaiah 19 just real quick here. So I find as we go through Isaiah, we often end up talking about eschatology, but I think that's because Isaiah actually is about last days things, right? All the prophecies in Isaiah are about things about the messianic kingdom and Christ's exercise of his authority. So we end up talking about eschatology, which is the study of the last things, or so these fit in here. So Isaiah 19, an oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. So here's the Lord coming on a cloud to Egypt. And the idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. And I will stir up Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will fight against each other and against his neighbor. City against city, kingdom against kingdom. This is like language repeated in Matthew 24 about what's going on with in the first century. But this is about the Egyptians in 800 years before Christ, 700 years before Christ, right? And the spirit of the Egyptians within them will be emptied out, and I will confound their counsel, and they will inquire of their idols and their sorcerers and the mediums and the necromancers, and I will give over the Egyptians into the hand of a hard master, and a fierce king will rule over them, declares the Lord of hosts. And it just, it goes on like that. It's this is a prophecy when you look at the commentators, or if you know your history, this is a prophecy that is already fulfilled in the past. It's not about the second coming, even though the Lord is coming on a cloud to Egypt. It's
Is
not the
this like
second coming.
the Greek conquering of Egypt?
Yeah, it's an intertestamental period, 300-400 BC, something like that. And so this has already taken place. This is not something that we're looking forward in the future, but in principle, the same thing happens. The Lord does judge his enemies at the end, but this particular judgment specifically has already taken place. But the language used, the Lord coming on a cloud to judge Egypt. Did anybody see him? No, nobody saw him. They didn't see the Lord. What they saw was the effect of the Lord. And so anyway, that's one example from the Old Testament, which would lend some support to what I said a couple of minutes ago. But yeah, so anyway, I'm not that's the interpretation that the Son of Man coming on clouds passages has to do with Daniel 7, and there's an ascension passage, which that particular interpretation is widely held, and it's not novel to me. It's not a new interpretation. It's actually a standard interpretation in most um, I don't know, maybe not in most I was going to say most churches, but not sure about that, but it is held in most denominations on a denominational level. But in most
Confessional
churches, I think,
Orthodox.
yeah, exactly. So I think that we've been really influenced by dispensationalism and its insistence that any reference to the coming of the Lord is always a reference to the second coming. And I think that just naturally most people just fall into that when they're reading the Bible. They don't realize that perhaps that's not the case. It would be really hard, actually, I think, to make a biblical case that the passages about the Son of Man coming with clouds are about the second coming if you take the origin of those words into consideration. If you go back to Daniel 7, you cannot make a case that Daniel 7 is about the second coming. And if that's the case, that it's not about the second coming in Daniel 7, and Jesus is intentionally applying these words and that title to himself, then the conclusion then, or at least the starting point of your interpretation, would have to be, this is not about the second coming. And the only way you could really overthrow that is to say Jesus is not using these words the way that everybody would have understood them. Because those are the only Son of Man coming with clouds. It's the only Son of Man coming with clouds passage in the Old Testament. You have coming with clouds. You have God coming with clouds. of Son of Man in Ezekiel, but the only passage that combines those ideas is that Daniel passage. So, is that helpful?
Yes.
Okay. Helpful or confusing.
Mhm.
Matthew 24 is always, if you go to Matthew 24, there's always questions because it's a battleground, for different interpretive systems.
Hmm.
So Mark 13:27 is the next passage. It says the same thing as the Matthew 24, and then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. So we have a little bit more slightly different phrase there, but it's still the Old Testament phrases about, from the ends of earth to the ends of heaven, etc. And again, these are regathering passages of the regathering of God's scattered people, not in a physical, I'd say not primarily in a physical sense, but primarily in a regathering to him. Their first thing where they were scattered was they were separated from him and then scattered to the nations. And so the return to him is talked about as the regathering. So anyway, that set of passages about that we just went over about the four corners of the earth. I think those are really helpful to, understand in reference to the regathering of God's people in a spiritual way into the kingdom of God through the preaching of the gospel. That's what's going on.
Are these
So,
interpretations you mentioned of the angels, that what's the picture being uh, put forth here is of God's Christ's disciples going throughout the earth and spreading the gospel, right?
mhm.
Um, I don't know. There might be some that take that the use of the word angel there is purely symbolic, but with Christ just having been given all power and authority in heaven on earth, um, is there interpretations of this to take this to say like Christ commanded his angels to go down to minister to his disciples who are now going to spread his word?
Yeah, there are that's a legitimate understanding, and it's not the most common one.
Mhm.
The Probably the most common one would get to that if they, spent enough paragraphs writing about it, they'd eventually get there. I think that the most common one is that the angels are involved in um, the ministerial work that Christ does to his people,
Mhm.
and that it's through that work of his people, that the church is in gathered. So the
Mhm.
angels are involved in that. Oh, excuse me, just dropped one of my.
Mhm.
Let me see if I can get that without bending over. That'll be fun. Oh, got it. All right. Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Well, yeah,
Yep.
Okay, good.
yeah.
So yeah, I think I don't know if I just exactly said what you said. I think I probably did. Um,
I mean, I just asked because it gets a little confusing to think of the word angels there being used symbolically or metaphorically of God's people going out and doing things like angels, but where Christ is commanding actual angels. It just seems a little confusing to use angels as a metaphor for what we're doing on earth.
right. So it's not really a metaphor. And I'm trying to open up logos, but it occurs to me that you can do this on Bible Gateway. So,
Oh yeah, like
right.
messenger, like just the more literal meaning of
Yeah.
the word angel being messengers. His messengers are going out, right?
Yeah. Messengers are going out, but even more than that, right? It's, you can, let's see. So I'm going to pull up my Mounts Bible, reverse interlinear, and see what word's being used. So there's angels, angelos, and
Hmm.
angelo. And then if I look at everywhere angelos appears in the New Testament, it shows up 175 times. So I'm just going to go, just for the sake of speed here, I'm going to go to, like, saving time. I'm going to go to Paul's letters.
Well, before you go there, can I ask
Yeah.
a question on Mark?
Yeah, sure.
Where it talks about shall gather together his elect. Is this elect referring to the 144,000 Jews that we talked about in Revelation?
Yeah, the elect are the 144,000 in Revelation 7 and 14. That's the combined perfect number of all of God's people, Jew and Gentile. So yeah, all of God's people. If that's how
Okay,
you're
thank you.
defining the 144,000, then the answer is yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so that is interesting. So I am not seeing what I expected to see. I know that word translated angel is also it's one sent messenger angel. But I'm not seeing a passage. And I just scanned 175 passages. But I'm not seeing one where it looks like it's being applied to a man. So, but I think there's a variation of that word that is, but it is nevertheless is one of the standard interpretations to say this is about the church taking the gospel, and that's how the people are gathered. But the reason it's translated or given the way it is in the translation is because Jesus is because Jesus is speaking in a way that is picturesque. So I owe you some passages where that word is being used, so I'll look those up.
Yeah, I get the gist of it, but yeah, it'll be nice to see the actual passages to kind of solidify it.
Yeah, yeah. So I owe you that. I wasn't thinking I would be talking about that word, so I hadn't prepared as much as I would want to. So I'll get you that.
Chuck,
Yeah, Catherine.
I don't want to add to the confusion because I know Mike is no, really, he's very sincere with his question, but the NAS has in verse 31, and he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. The NAS says the other word that could be used for angels is chosen ones. Now, am I making it more confusing for Mike?
Is that the other word for angels or
Yes.
elect? Huh.
Let's look here. Oh,
I
yeah.
think that's the other word
I'm
for
sorry. No, I'm confusing everybody for sure. It's for, I'm sorry, Mike. I'm sorry, everyone. You're right.
That's-
It is for elect, his chosen ones. And that's the same one that's in Mark, or the one that Shirley
Yeah,
just
Mark.
asked you.
Mark
In Mark,
13.
right.
Yeah.
When they talked about the elect. Okay, I apologize. I'm very sorry, Mike.
Yeah, that's okay.
Oh, that's all right.
It's not elect. I mean, it's not chosen ones. Oh, okay.
I think we're all on the same page. I think we all got that.
Yeah.
Right. So
Matthew, I guess check real quick, Matthew 11:10.
yeah.
This is John, I'm sorry, John the Baptist quoting, I think, quoting something in the old, quoting Malachi. And then this is also Luke 7:24, but Matthew, sort of John the Baptist quoting Malachi, behold, I
Malachi
send a
3:1.
messenger before your face, who will prepare the way for you. So Malachi talking about John the Baptist as angelos, a messenger.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So you're going to have that same thing in Mark chapter 1, where this is quoted. And it's like Mark 1, verse 2, I think. A couple other places. Right. So messenger there is angelos. And that is about a human messenger.
Mhm.
So thank you. Yes, there's at least that. Um, so anyway, it looks like we're at 10:30. So one day we'll probably want to go through all of Matthew 24 again, and because it's a good refresher for using how to interpret the Old Testament, because Jesus is continually referring to it. But anyway, today we got through one point on the outline, which was about the four corners of the earth and how that's being used in the Old Testament, and then what that's talking about, the gathering of God's people, spiritual gathering that takes place in the last days as a result of the preaching of the gospel. And this is orchestrated by God, bringing people to hear his gospel. And in relation to his ancient covenant people, the Jews, they will hear the gospel from Gentile messengers and eventually be regathered into God's people. And that's what Paul talks about in Romans 9 through 11. So that's what I had today. Want to thank everybody for your participation and for your being here. And I want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, because we won't meet again in this class until 2 weeks. So let me turn off the recording